Hello and welcome back to the Training Tom podcast, the place where I share the lessons I've learned, the challenges I'm currently facing, and the questions I have for my future self. And in today's episode, we're talking about labels and the labels that we place on ourselves. So let's get into it. I've been thinking a lot about labels recently, and in particular the labels that I place on myself, but also the labels that perhaps we place on other people, or the labels that we place on our relationships, the labels that we place on ourselves at work. And part of the reason why I've been thinking about labels a lot is because of what I've been working on in my professional life, but also some things that I've been managing in my personal life as well. It's feels a bit strange for me to talk about the personal life side of things, but I'm going to try and do my best in a way that feels right to me. So I've been thinking about labels in terms of dating and in terms of relationships, because I've been seeing somebody for a couple of months now, and we've spoken about labels and where we're at in our dating, I guess, journey. The process, that sounds so professional, and you can probably tell that it feels a bit uncomfortable for me to talk about. But basically we've been speaking about labels and where we're both at in our dating phase. Let's go with that. Our dating phase or our dating chapter. It's been good to have open discussions with this person about if we feel that like we need to place a label on things, if now is the right time to place a label on things, and how we both feel with our dating dynamic. I think that's probably the most comfortable way for me to phrase it and to talk about it, which probably sounds quite inconspicuous or sounds a bit cloak and dagger, but just for where I'm at this moment in time, feels like the most comfortable way to talk about it. So labels has been spoken about in my dating life, and it's also something that I've been kind of doing a bit of work on in my professional life as well. Not from placing labels on people at work, but more just the psychology around the labels that we might have, the psychology around behavior, and how to support people with changing their behavior. Because I feel like a lot of the time, and this is partly through the research that I've been doing at work, the reason why we perhaps find it difficult to change our behavior is potentially because of the labels that we place upon ourselves. And this leads me nicely on to talking about the main focus of this episode today, is how labels can impact our life. And I want this to focus predominantly on the labels we place upon ourselves and not the labels that other people might place upon us and the labels that we might have with other people. I think it's going to be very independent focused. And the first thing that I want to kind of mention is that actually labels can be really helpful. I know that in the past for myself, I've placed labels on myself that have been really beneficial and have actually helped me to potentially achieve the things that I've been able to achieve in my fitness life or in my professional life. Things like being, you might place the label on yourself of being sporty, athletic, those fitness and exercise related labels, for instance, which I've placed upon myself and feel like have really helped me to achieve some of the challenges that I have achieved through exercise and through my fitness. You might be more creative minded, be more into the arts, into music, into drama and all the kind of more arts focused things. So you might place a label on yourself of being artistic or being creative. I would also say that I've placed a label on myself of being ambitious, which again, I think has been beneficial because it's meant that I've strived for things and I've set myself goals that have pushed me out of my reach and out of my comfort zone to try and learn more, to try and grow, to try and develop. So those, I would say, have been very useful and been very helpful labels. Maybe your label is related to work. Maybe you're an accountant, a teacher, a lawyer, a software engineer, a mechanic, a builder, whatever it might be. But that label you've placed on yourself has supported you with the career that you're currently in and the career aspirations that you might have, or the amount of enjoyment you get out of your work. But I also think that sometimes labels can hinder us. Labels can place us inside a box, and they don't expose us to different challenges, because we might say, because of the label that we have for ourselves, that's not me. That challenge that you are doing, that's not me, because that's not who I am. That's not the label I have for myself. And the reason why it's been so prominent in my work and my professional life is because I often hear a label from people of not being an exercise person, or I'm not very sporty, I'm not very athletic, I'm not an exerciser. Which, when it comes around to health and fitness, which is predominantly what my work relates around and focuses on, that tends to mean that people behave in a way that means they don't exercise. They don't support their health through being physically active, through moving their body, because they don't see themselves as sporty, or they don't see themselves as somebody who exercises, because they've placed that label upon themselves. And through my experience anyway, it has typically led to these people having health challenges because they don't exercise, they don't look after their health. But that's a whole other rabbit hole. But what I'm essentially trying to say is the label has held them back in one way or another, and has had consequences on their life that, have caused them some discomfort and caused them to experience challenges, like I've said, related to their health. These labels can extend beyond that, and they are often things that we associate quite heavily with our identity. I know in the past I've labelled myself as an anxious person. I've labelled myself as an introvert. I've even, earlier in the podcast, said that I've been dating somebody, and I've even labelled myself in the past as being alone or being single. And a lot of the time that has very negative connotations attached to it. And they form part of your identity and can start to define who you are. I know that for a long time, that some of the labels I've placed on myself, from a positive and from a negative perspective, have been very defining, and have meant that I have lived to those labels because that's who I thought I was. Maybe it's not who I was, but it's who I thought I should be. And like I say, there are some instances where that works out in a good way and it supports you, and that label is very helpful. I think there are other times where perhaps it is not as helpful. So what I'm trying to say is, some of the labels that we place on ourselves, they might not be good or bad. They might not be right or wrong. They might not be positive or negative. It depends on how we perceive those labels and how we look at those labels. I think the key thing here that I'm trying to get across is, are the labels that we place on ourselves serving us? Or is the label that you place on yourself, is it serving you at the moment? So if you've been like me and you've labelled yourself as an introvert, and you've labelled yourself as shy, maybe you've labelled yourself as not being very confident, is that serving you at the moment? Do you feel good about placing that label upon yourself? Likewise, if you place a label on yourself of being creative, of being athletic, of being, maybe it's related to your work, of being an accountant, of being a project manager, of being a teacher, whatever it might be, is that label serving you? How do you perceive that label that you've placed upon yourself? If you perceive it to be a good thing and you perceive it to be something that is working for you, then great. Maybe it's not something that you need to consider and it's not something you need to think about. But if there are other labels that you place on yourself that aren't serving you and aren't supporting you to be the person that you want to be, then perhaps those labels either need to be removed or they need to be changed to be something that could be more beneficial and could be supporting you better. An example for this, for me, has been very prominent recently, and being very, when I say recently, I mean over the past couple of years, because like I said, I always labelled myself as being quite a shy person, being quite an introverted personality, and generally speaking, not being a very confident person. But over the past couple of years, I've started socialising a lot more and trying to find new groups of people. And at the beginning of 2024, or the end of 2023, I should say, I started dating as well. So that meant that I was socialising a lot more and wanting to meet new people. So I had to address, or I started to address, those labels that I'd placed on myself. Those historical labels of being shy, being introverted, and not being confident meant that when I met new people, I would potentially portray those and would perhaps feel like I'm not a nice person, but not an interesting person to be around. And when you're meeting new people, when you're dating, you want to be perhaps a more interesting person to be around. But I tried to challenge those labels and tried to look at those labels in a different way, because actually when I looked at my life as a whole, around the right people and in certain situations, I could be the complete opposite of those labels that I'd placed on myself. I could be an extroverted person. I could be a confident person. I could be a very outgoing person as well. So just because I had placed labels on myself of being shy, of being introverted, of being not very confident, didn't mean that I was those things in every situation. And typically, around the right people, like I said, I could be the complete opposite. So if I could be the opposite in certain situations, I then started to ask myself, well, could I start bringing that version of Tom into other areas of my life? Could I bring the confident, the extroverted, the outgoing version of Tom into my dating life? Could I bring it into my social life? Could I bring it into my family life and all the different areas of my life? And rather than being two separate people or feeling like I was two separate people, could I be the same person, but just know when to turn things up and when to and dial things back? And that was a very interesting period for me, because I actually learned that, or I feel like I learned that, generally speaking, I was actually the opposite of those labels that I'd placed on myself. Generally speaking, I was quite a confident person. I was quite an outgoing person. I was quite an extroverted person. But then there would also be times in my life where I wanted to be more alone, more introverted. I wanted to be with my own thoughts and be with myself. and not have all of that confident bravado, that extroversion, that outgoing nature, because it wasn't the right situation. And perhaps I needed to be more introverted and be more, what's the word I'm looking for? Be more within myself to recharge and to refresh myself from those periods of extroversion, of confidence, of being very outgoing and speaking to new people and seeing new people. So that was very, very interesting. And it's something that I feel like I'm still learning to manage and get the balance right, because last year in particular, I perhaps went too far in the opposite direction and was extroverted, outgoing, confident all of the time, and drained my battery very quickly. I didn't embrace that introverted and that within myself version often enough and allowed my body to recharge. So I feel like now I'm trying to find the right balance. And I think being around the right people is helping that, and knowing when to dial things up and when to tone things down a little bit as well. And that's just a period of learning and a process of learning that, yeah, I'm still going on, like I say. But it was certainly interesting for me to go through that, to understand that the labels I'd historically placed on myself weren't necessarily serving me for the person that I wanted to be. I think another example of that is a completely different example where, again, historically, I've always placed the label on myself of being very sporty, of being very athletic, of not being very creative and not being very musically gifted or musically talented or being very artistic. But I've always wanted to learn how to play the piano or learn how to play a musical instrument. And over lockdown, I decided to try and learn to play the piano because I'm very fortunate, or I consider myself to be quite fortunate in that I've got an electric piano at home. My sister used to play the piano, so I had it there. It hadn't been used for a long time. So I thought, well, I've always wanted to learn how to play. And during lockdown, it was the perfect time because I didn't have anything else to do. So I found an app that didn't teach me about musical skill or music, how to read music or anything like that. It simply showed me what keys to press to play the songs that I wanted to learn. And I learned 4 or 5 songs during lockdown and even after lockdown as well, that I was then able to play without having to read music and without having to even have anything up in front of me. I could just learn it from memory by knowing what keys to press and what tempo to play the music at. And it again showed me that the labels that I'd placed on myself of not being creative, not being musical, not being artistic, hadn't necessarily been serving me. They had been almost holding me back because I wasn't exposing myself to that opportunity to learn a new skill. Now, since learning those different songs on the piano, I've forgotten about half of them because I haven't been practicing. But I still can sit down at the piano and there are still a couple of songs that were very easy and very basic that I can play. And it does fill me with joy that I can sit at the piano and do that whenever I feel like it. And it is something that I think once I've got past my Ironman training and some of the, I guess, physical challenges that I'm in at the moment, it's something that I would love to get back to. But I now have the confidence to go back to that, having had that experience in the past. And I think the key thing for me to take away from both of those examples is labels can often place us in a box. They can put us in this almost very narrow-minded path of, I am this person, and if I do anything that doesn't fit within this box, then it's not who I am, and it's not the label that I place upon myself. And it can feel very uncomfortable to do that. But what both of those examples showed me is that by actually either expanding my box or thinking outside of that box and stepping into a different box, I could learn new skills. By starting to challenge some of those labels that I'd placed upon myself, And starting to step outside of my comfort zone as well, it meant that I learned those labels aren't set in stone. They can be rewritten. We can learn to be new people. We can learn to be different people. We can start to challenge the assumptions that we have and the assumptions we hold of ourselves. I think work is another prime example in that, especially I think for people in their 20s, the way the world seems to work at the moment is that we often get told once you have to decide what career you want to be in when you're at school. And a lot of the time, you don't know what career is the right one for you until you start trying those things. I know for myself that I never anticipated being in the position that I am in at the moment and doing the career that I have, or doing the job that I have at the moment 10 years ago, when I was choosing my degree, when I was finishing my A-levels. This wasn't something that I had ever considered doing. But I removed a label from myself and I challenged myself to do something different because, quite frankly, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And that has led me to doing the job that I'm doing currently. I also feel like that applies later on in life as well, in that a lot, just from maybe speaking to my parents or speaking to people that are 10, 15, 20 years plus older than me, that have changed career, or maybe they haven't changed career, but don't enjoy the job that they're doing. I think we can sometimes get stuck with those labels of, this is my job and I will do this job forever, or I will do this job until I retire. When actually, maybe there is some merit in trying something new. In fact, I don't think maybe is the right word. No, maybe is the right word, because there are lots of situational things to be aware of when making a big decision like that. The responsibilities that you have towards your spouse and towards your family may mean that changing that career isn't an option. But if it is an option, then yeah, maybe it is a label that we can remove from ourselves, and doing something completely different might change your career trajectory and might bring you more joy or bring you more content through your professional life. So that was something that, yeah, has become more prominent to me, is that, yeah, those labels that we place on ourselves can sometimes hold us back and sometimes keep us in the box that we're in. But then when we actually remove those labels, or we challenge those labels and try new things and try things that are outside of that box, and maybe even place ourselves into a different box, that is where we can learn so many new things. That is where actually we can change the way that we view ourselves. Maybe it will change the way that other people view us too, which can be quite a liberating thing. It's a very uncomfortable thing, but I think can be a very liberating thing, because it proves to you, and I think for me in particular, it's proved to me that just because I have a label on myself at one moment of time in my life doesn't mean that I'm always going to carry that label. It also means that I now feel like I can do anything. I've done a range of different jobs over the course of the past 12 years. And yes, they have all been in health and fitness, I would say. But some of the challenges that I've experienced in my work life has translated into my personal life as well, and proved to me that I can do anything. I don't need to place a label on myself. If I remove some of those labels, or I challenge some of those labels, then I can do anything. I can be anybody that I want to be. And maybe that is a perspective that I have learned to have. In fact, I know I've not always had that perspective, but I feel very fortunate that it is a perspective that I have now. And this also brings me on to another thing with those labels is that oftentimes those labels have come from learning skills or from not learning other skills. You know, being shy could be something that you've grown up being. So you've been in an environment where you've been surrounded by shy people or introverted people. Maybe your parents were quite shy and introverted people. So that was how you were expected or how you thought you should behave. So then you carry that label through with you into adulthood and you just feel like that's who you are. But actually, we can change that label and we can challenge that assumption we have of ourselves. And by challenging that assumption we have of ourselves, we can actually learn a new skill. I very much believe that a lot of the things that we do in life and a lot of the behaviors we can exhibit, like confidence, are skills that can be learned. Maybe other people have a different perspective. Maybe other people think that it is very much a genetic trait that we have. But I feel like from my own experience, and if I look at my family and the traits that I grew up with, I consider myself now to be a very confident person, or quite a confident person. Whereas in the past, I was considered myself to be a very shy person. And I think that was perhaps a behaviour that I learnt. So therefore it was a skill that I learned. And if I could learn to be shy, then I could also learn to be confident. So maybe that's a debate for another time, is nature versus nurture, but I sit very much, or I lean very much towards the nurture camp, in that a lot of the things we do in life are skills that can be learnt. And this brings me on to, I believe, a wider point. And it's a very philosophical point, but it's about life in general. Life for me is about trying. Or now, I should rephrase that actually. Now, life for me is about trying. We have to try to live. That might be trying at work and in your professional life. That might be trying new skills. That might be trying to love somebody. Which are all quite scary things and quite uncomfortable things, because it does mean we have to expose ourselves. However, I feel like the fear of exposing yourself in that way, whether it is, you know, by trying a new challenge or by, exposing your personal life to somebody that you care about, it means that you live. And you truly live, rather than just not trying and, not allowing yourself to be exposed in that way, and always having barriers up. You know, I've spoken before about the barriers that I've put up in my life, in that a lot of the time I don't allow people in. And recently, through dating, through speaking to my friends more openly, I have been trying to allow people in, which has meant that I have felt more alive. And I've been trying to live more. But there's also a bigger question to ask to round this episode off, is actually, do we need to place any labels on ourselves in the first place? Do we need to have this label of, I am this person? Or when I'm with somebody, we are this? Does it actually matter what labels we place on ourselves? Because maybe simply placing a label on ourselves in the first place, regardless of whether it's good or bad, positive or negative, right or wrong, is the thing that is holding us back. What if we didn't place a label on ourselves in the first place? And actually, we just tried to live. We didn't try to live we didn't try to live based on a label we'd placed on ourselves. We just tried to live based on the values we hold about ourselves. And I think that's perhaps a nice thing to finish on, is trying to remind ourselves that, yes, it's very easy for me to say, try not to place a label on yourself. Because I think we all do it. I know for a fact that I still place labels on myself, and probably will continue to place labels on myself for the rest of my life. But maybe the more important thing to think about is, actually, am I living true to my values? Regardless of what labels that I place on myself, am I living true to my values? And as long as I'm living true to my values, maybe that's all that matters. Maybe the labels around it don't really matter at all. Maybe I don't need to be this type of person. Maybe actually I just need to, live true to the values, like I say. I don't think we need to have value. We need to have values. We definitely need to have values. I don't think we need to place labels on ourselves. And like I say, it's very easy for me to say. And I know that I will probably continue to place labels on myself. But I don't think we need to. Why can't we just live and try new things, try to do things differently, try to do things that align with our values and who we think we are? But then maybe we don't need to align things with who we think we are, because maybe that is the very thing that's holding us back. So that's why I wanted to finish on that point of values, because we might have these labels that we place on ourselves, but they might not align with the values that we have, or maybe the ambitions that we have. I don't know. But I think trying not to place a label on ourselves so quickly could be a beneficial thing for all of us. I think for myself, definitely, trying not to place a label on myself, or even a label on my relationships, is possibly a good thing. It's an uncomfortable thing, because I've always placed labels on myself of this is who I am. Maybe I can just live. And as long as I'm living, like I say, to my values, it doesn't matter what that label is, because I'm living to the values that I hold for myself. So I feel like this episode has taken a bit of a turn. It's maybe, if I can get my words out, as you might be able to tell, I'm a little bit bunged up with my hay fever at the moment. But maybe this has taken a bit of, it's gone around the houses a little bit. Hopefully it's been eye-opening though. Hopefully it's made you think about your perspective, maybe the labels you hold for yourself, the labels that you place on yourself. And maybe it can just shine a different perspective on the things that you do, the way that you view yourself. Like I say in a lot of my episodes, that's all I'm trying to do, is challenge your perspectives, share my opinions, my thoughts, try and be as transparent and authentic as possible. I hope I've done that in this episode. It's still something that I'm learning to do, and something that still in certain topics, like dating and my romantic relationships, still feels very uncomfortable to talk about. But it is something that I want to talk about more often in the future, because I think it's a very important thing to discuss. So bear with me on that one. There are other things that I feel very, very, very open to talk about, as you've probably gathered, around mental health. But let's leave this episode here. This episode has been all about labels, the labels we hold or the labels we place on ourselves. And hopefully it has challenged your perspective on the labels you hold of yourself. Maybe later on this week, it might be beneficial to do some reflection on that and ask yourself some of the questions that I've been asking of you during this episode around what labels you hold for yourself, and also whether you feel like those labels are serving you or not. Are they restricting you in any way? But let's bring this episode to a close. Thank you very much for listening. And as always, my name is Tom Regan, and this is the Training Tom podcast.